It's one thing to feel let down by your own political party, but it's a whole other level of messed up when you feel like they've been lying to your face. Like all those promises about fighting for everyday people, for a fairer system, and then it seems like all they actually care about is holding on to their power. It's rough.
Totally. And that feeling of being disillusioned, it's something that's coming up a lot in what you sent over. It's not just about policy disagreements or anything, it's deeper. Like people feel like the Democratic Party has lost sight of what they're supposed to stand for.
Yeah, like this idea of neoliberal fascism that keeps popping up. It sounds kind of extreme, I know, but when you actually look at the arguments, some of them are pretty thought-provoking. It's like, on the surface, everything's about freedom and individual rights, but then underneath, it's all about corporations and a select few at the top getting to keep their power, no matter the cost.
You're spot on. Neoliberal fascism is a complicated term. It's often used to describe this gradual shift towards authoritarianism, and the scary part is it can happen even in systems that call themselves democratic. Think about it. We have elections, yeah, but are the choices we're given really that different? The media is largely controlled. And speaking out against the mainstream narrative, it feels like that's being shut down more and more.
Okay, I see how that connects to some of the frustrations. It's like, sure, we can vote, but are we really getting to choose from options that represent different ways forward? Or is it more like picking between, I don't know, two different brands of the same thing?
And that limited choice, that shrinking of the political spectrum, is something a lot of these articles are highlighting. The argument is that the Democratic Party, by embracing neoliberal policies, has actually helped the far right to gain strength.
Wait, really? How does that even make sense?
Well, think about the economic policies of the past few decades.
Mhm.
Free trade agreements, less regulation, privatization. The argument is that these policies have resulted in massive wealth inequality. The middle class is shrinking. And a lot of people feel like the system is rigged against them from the start.
So if you feel like this system's never going to work for you, you're going to be angry,
Right.
frustrated. And then people start looking for something else, anything else, even if it's extreme. That makes sense, I guess.
Precisely. And some of the sources go even further, saying that the Democratic Party's focus on identity politics has created more division within the left and made it harder to stand united against these bigger systemic issues.
So instead of coming together on things that could unite us, things like economic justice, affordable health care, better education, we're getting caught up in these cultural battles that only benefit the people already in power.
That's the argument, yep. And it ties into this feeling of hypocrisy that you mentioned. The Democrats talk about fighting for equality, but then they back policies that make inequality worse. They talk about democracy, but then they try to weaken third parties that challenge their position.
It's like that saying, Democrats fall in love with the fight but never actually win the war. It's all about showing how outreach they are without actually changing anything.
And that kind of performative activism can be really off-putting for voters who are looking for real systemic change. It's like they're being told, we hear you, we see you, but then their actions tell a different story.
Speaking of actions not matching words, let's talk about the Green Party. One of the articles you sent actually had a job posting from the DNC about keeping tabs on Green Party candidates. It's kind of messed up, like they don't even trust their own voters to make up their own minds.
It does make you question their view of democracy, right? If they were so confident in their platform and their ideas, why resort to tactics like that?
Exactly. It's like they're saying, we're all for democracy as long as it gives us the result we want. That's not democracy at all.
And this tendency to try to silence those who disagree, it's not just limited to third parties like the Green Party. You also flagged concerns about censorship and free speech, especially when it comes to things like COVID-19 policies.
Oh, yeah. There were some pretty heated arguments about those. The idea that Democrats were trying to shut down any questioning of the official narrative, that hit a nerve for a lot of people.
Think about it. If they were so sure they were on the right side, why be so afraid of open debate?
It makes you wonder if maybe they're more interested in being in control than they are in having an honest conversation about what's best for everyone.
And that, I think, gets to the heart of this growing disillusionment that you're feeling, that a lot of people are feeling. It's not just about disagreeing with specific policies. It's about a loss of faith in the Democratic Party's ability to actually live up to the values they say they believe in.
It's like they've forgotten that disagreement and debate are normal parts of democracy. Different perspectives are allowed to exist. And when you try to shut those voices down, even the ones you disagree with, you're messing with the very foundation of a free society.
And this brings us back to neoliberal fascism, because one of the hallmarks of fascism is silencing dissent. creating an us versus them situation where anyone who questions the dominant narrative is labeled as an enemy.
Hold on. Are we saying the Democratic Party is becoming fascist? That seems like a stretch.
I think it's more complicated than that. What these sources are suggesting is that there are some patterns in how the Democratic Party thinks and acts, some tendencies that echo things we see in fascism, even if it's not a full-blown fascist regime.
Okay, I get that. It's not like they're marching in the streets, but there are these subtle ways they're trying to control what people think, to silence those who disagree, to hold on to their power.
Exactly. And that's what makes it so dangerous. It's not always in your face. It's not always easy to pinpoint, but it's there underneath the surface.
So if we're not talking about full-blown fascism, then what are we talking about? What's the end goal here? Where are these tendencies leading?
That's a question these sources are wrestling with. There's no easy answer. But one thing is for sure. If the Democratic Party keeps going down this road, if they keep choosing power over principles, if they keep silencing dissent and ignoring the people they're supposed to represent, they risk losing all credibility.
And if that happens, what are people supposed to do when they feel like the whole system has failed them?
That's a scary thought, and it should give us all pause. Because when people lose faith in the system, when they feel like they have no voice, that's when things can really start to fall apart.
Okay, so we've painted a pretty grim picture. Is there any hope here? Is there a way for the Democratic Party to get back on track, to get back to basics, to actually start fighting for the people they're supposed to represent?
That's the million-dollar question, and we'll be diving deeper into it as we look closer at these sources. But one thing that keeps coming up is this call for the Democratic Party to do some serious soul-searching.
So it's not about pointing fingers or playing the blame game, but about taking a good hard look in the mirror and saying, we screwed up. We need to do better.
Precisely. And that means being open to hearing criticism, even when it's uncomfortable, and making real changes to address the concerns that are being raised.
So less talk, more action.
Hmm.
Less pretending to care and more actually caring.
You got it. It's about moving beyond just showing off and actually taking concrete steps to fix the things that are driving people away from the party.
And if they don't, if they just keep doing the same old things, what then?
Well, that's where things get interesting. Because one of the sources you sent asked a very provocative question. What if the Democratic Party is becoming part of the problem, not the solution?
Whoa. Okay, let's break that down. What does that even mean?
It means asking ourselves some tough questions. What happens when the party that claims to be the champion of democracy starts acting in ways that are undemocratic? What happens when the party that's supposed to be fighting for equality supports policies that actually make inequality worse?
That's a pretty disturbing thought.
It is, and it's one we'll be exploring more as we continue our deep dive.
Well, you've definitely given me a lot to think about. And I have a feeling this is just the beginning.
Oh, it is just the beginning. And you know what's crazy is that this disillusionment with the Democratic Party, it's not just some theoretical debate, It has real-world consequences for how people participate or don't participate in politics.
Right, like that whole thing about blaming voters instead of owning up to their losses. That came up a lot in what you said.
Oh, absolutely. You notice how over and over the Democrats seem to blame their losses on things outside their control. Russia, third-party voters, always someone else to blame.
It's like they're saying, if only those Bernie bros had just gotten on board, or those Jill Stein voters stayed home, we would have won. It's infuriating.
And that kind of talk, it's not just frustrating, It actually pushes voters away and makes them less likely to participate in the whole democratic process.
Because who wants to vote if they feel like it doesn't even matter? Or that they're going to be the scapegoat if their candidate loses?
Exactly. When voters feel like their concerns are being brushed aside, when they see the system as rigged against them, it just breeds cynicism and apathy.
And that cynicism, that apathy, it's like a poison slowly eating away at the very core of democracy.
You're absolutely right. And speaking of a rigged system, we got to talk about what you shared regarding the 2016 and 2024 Democratic primaries. Some of these sources have some serious accusations about the DNC actively working to make sure their chosen candidate won the nomination.
Yeah, the whole super delegate thing, the way the debates were scheduled, it all felt very Wizard of Oz, like pay no attention to the man behind the curtain.
And the sources you picked out, they argue that these weren't just random incidents, but part of a bigger pattern of behavior. Makes you wonder, are the Democratic primaries really about letting the voters choose? Or is it about the party elites staying in control?
Because if it's the latter, how is that any different from the systems we claim to be against?
It's a valid question. And it's one the Democratic Party needs to seriously consider if they want to win back those voters who are feeling disillusioned and betrayed.
It's like they're saying, vote for us, we're the good guys. But then they do the same shady backroom deals and power grabs that they accuse the other side of doing.
And that hypocrisy, that gap between what they say and what they do, it's one of the most damaging things a political party can do. It erodes trust, not just in the party, but in the entire political system.
Okay, so we've talked about the disillusionment, the hypocrisy, the tendency to blame voters instead of taking responsibility. But what about solutions? Is there a way to fix this mess?
Well, one thing a lot of these sources point to is the need for a major shift in how the Democratic Party operates. Not just little tweaks here and there. They need to tackle the root causes of this disillusionment.
So what does that actually look like?
It starts with owning up to the problem, being willing to hear the criticism, even when it stings, and truly taking a look inward.
So less of that, we know what's best for you attitude, and more, let's hear what the people actually want.
Precisely. It's about moving away from a top-down approach and towards a more grassroots bottom-up approach, where the party actually answers to its members and the communities they're supposed to represent.
Sounds good on paper, but how do you make that happen in the real world? We're talking about a huge political machine.
You're right, it's not going to be easy. But those sources you sent, they offer some concrete ideas. One recurring theme is the need for more transparency and accountability within the party itself.
So things like open primaries, getting rid of superdelegates, making the whole process more democratic.
Exactly. Giving voters a genuine say in choosing who represents them, not just rubber stamping the choices of party insiders.
Another thing that kept coming up is the need for campaign finance reform.
Mhm.
It's hard to believe the Democrats when they say they represent the working class, when they're so dependent on donations from big corporations.
That's a major issue. Several sources argue that as long as the Democratic Party is beholden to these big money interests, they'll never be able to truly represent the needs of ordinary people.
It's like putting a fox in charge of the henhouse.
Some sources suggest looking into things like public financing of elections, which could help level the playing field and reduce the influence of corporate money in politics.
Okay, I can see that. But it's not just about changing the rules, right? It's also about changing the people who are playing the game.
Absolutely. And that's where the need for new leadership comes in. A lot of the sources you shared want to see new faces, leaders who actually believe in progressive values and who are willing to challenge the status quo.
It's like they're saying, we need more AOCs and fewer. Well,
It's about moving past the same old tired strategies and embracing a new vision for the Democratic Party, one that's truly rooted in social, economic, and racial justice.
what about this whole issue of censorship and free speech being suppressed? A lot of people are worried about that, myself included.
You're right, and it's something we need to address directly. The sources you shared really highlight how dangerous it is to silence those who disagree, even if it's done with good intentions, like wanting to protect certain groups or stop the spread of false information.
I understand that. But isn't there a line somewhere? What about hate speech? There are some things that should be off limits, right?
It's a complicated question, and the sources grapple with that. They agree that there are certain types of speech that are harmful and should be condemned, but they also warn against using vague terms like hate speech and misinformation to shut down legitimate debate and disagreement.
Because if you start down that road, who decides what's okay to say and what isn't? What happens when hate speech starts to include any opinion that those in power don't like?
That's the slippery slope argument, and it's one we should consider seriously. The sources suggest that the best way to fight bad ideas isn't to censor them, but to engage with them, to challenge them with facts and logic, and to trust that people can think for themselves.
It's like that saying, sunlight is the best disinfectant.
Precisely. It's about fostering a culture of open and honest debate where different viewpoints can be shared, ideas can be tested, and the truth has a chance to win out.
I like the idea, but it feels like we're in a time when everyone is just talking over each other. There's no space for nuance or disagreeing without things getting ugly.
You're not wrong, but the sources you found, they offer a glimmer of hope. They point to the energy and activism of young people, especially those organizing around issues like climate change, racial justice, and economic inequality.
Like that whole uncommitted campaign you mentioned. Seeing young people withhold their votes in the primary to force the Democratic Party to take their concerns seriously was pretty inspiring.
Exactly. It's about using our voices, our votes, and our collective power to hold those in power accountable.
And that message resonates not just with young people, but with anyone who's tired of things staying the same, who wants to see change, who believes in the possibility of a better world.
Absolutely. And, something these sources really emphasize is that this isn't just about the Democratic Party, it's about the future of our democracy.
Because if we can't even have a political system that works, if we can't even agree on basic facts or have a civil conversation, how are we supposed to deal with the huge challenges facing our country and the planet?
Exactly. And that's why this conversation is so crucial. It's not about bashing the Democrats. It's about honestly assessing our democracy and asking ourselves some tough questions about what kind of future we want.
Yes. Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground. Disillusionment, hypocrisy, censorship, the need for reform, the importance of free speech, and a democracy that actually works. It's a lot to take in.
It is. But one thing that really stood out to me is that even with all these problems, there's still a lot of hope in these sources. There's a belief that we can do better, that we can create a world that's fairer and more just.
And that's what we need to hold on to, right? That sense of hope, that belief that change is possible. If we lose that, what's left?
Exactly. And I think that leads us to one of the most important questions these sources raise. What happens if the Democratic Party keeps going down this road? What if they continue to ignore the needs of their base, to prioritize power over doing what's right?
That's a question I'm almost afraid to think about.
Yeah.
It is a scary thought. And honestly, after going through all of this, it'd be easy to just give up and say, the system's broken, there's no point. But these sources, they're not thrown in the towel, they're still fighting. And that, honestly, gives me a little bit of hope.
I think that's the biggest takeaway. These sources, they're not supposed to make us feel hopeless. They're meant to kind of light a fire under us, make us think differently, expect more from our leaders, and even from ourselves.
So it's not about just accepting the way things are, but actually pushing for real change. But where do you even start? These issues feel so huge, so overwhelming.
I hear you. The challenges are massive, that's for sure. But one of the sources you sent really stuck with me. It argued that the Democratic Party, the way it is now, could actually be making things worse.
Okay, yeah, we touched on that earlier, but I think we need to go deeper. What does it even mean for the Democratic Party to be part of the problem? They're supposed to be the party of the people, right?
That's what they say, yeah. But this source argued that by holding on to power so tightly, by silencing anyone who disagrees, by putting corporate interests ahead of the needs of their own base, they're actually contributing to the very problems they say they're fighting against.
So it's like their actions are creating the perfect conditions for the far right to rise up, for democracy to crumble, for all the things we've been discussing.
It's a tough thing to think about. And it really makes you step back and look at the systems we're all part of, question what we believe, and see if what we're doing actually lines up with our values.
It's like that line from Spider-Man. With great power comes great responsibility. If the Democrats are going to say they're the champions of democracy, of equality, of fairness, then they have a responsibility to actually live up to those ideals.
Exactly. And that means being willing to have those difficult conversations, to face their own flaws, to make the changes they need to make to actually become the party they claim to be.
So less talk, more action. Less pretending to be virtuous and more actually being virtuous.
You got it. It's about putting those words into action.
What if they don't, though? What if they just keep ignoring all these warnings, all these calls for change? What's the worst that could happen?
Well, some of these sources don't sugarcoat it. They say that if the Democrats stay on this course, they could end up irrelevant, just a hollowed-out version of what they used to be, clinging to power while losing the trust and support of the very people they claim to represent.
And if that happens, if there's no one else to turn to, what fills that void?
That's the question that keeps me up at night, because when people completely lose faith in the system, when they feel like they have no voice, things can get really dangerous.
So this isn't just about fixing the Democratic Party for their own good. It's about saving our democracy, about protecting the very core of a free and just society.
Couldn't have said it better myself. And it's on all of us, not just the politicians. We all have a part to play in creating the future we want.
Okay, so we've talked about the problems. We've looked at what might happen if things don't change. But I keep coming back to this question. What can we do about it? How can we actually make a difference?
One thing that comes up a lot in these sources is how important grassroots organizing is. Building power from the ground up.
So we're not just waiting for the Democratic Party to get its act together. We're taking things into our own hands.
Exactly. It's realizing that we don't need permission to make change happen. We can start by organizing in our own communities, building relationships, supporting the candidates, and causes that align with what we believe in.
So things like phone banking, going door to door,
Hmm.
donating to organizations that are fighting for progress, that sort of thing.
Exactly. And it's not just about elections either. It's about being involved in what's happening locally, holding our elected officials accountable, creating a culture where we're all engaged citizens, not just voters who show up every few years.
It's like remembering that democracy is an action, not just a word. It's something we have to actively do, not something that just happens to us.
I like that. And it's also remembering that we're not alone in this. There are so many people across the country who are fed up with the way things are, who want to see change, who believe we can build a better world.
And by finding those people, building connections, working together, we can create a movement strong enough to challenge the system and demand more.
That's the hope, anyway. And it's a hope based on knowing that throughout history, the biggest, most lasting changes have come from social movements, not from political parties.
So even though we might be disappointed in the Democratic Party right now, we don't have to give up on the idea of progress. We can take that disappointment, that anger, that frustration, and turn it into something good, something that builds a better future.
Absolutely. And it's about remembering that quote from Martin Luther King Jr. The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. I think about that a lot when I'm feeling down.
It's a good reminder that even though the road ahead is probably going to be long and tough, we're fighting for what's right.
Hmm.
And if we keep fighting, if we keep pushing, in the end, we'll win.
That's a message that I think a lot of people need to hear right now.
Well, I think we've given our listeners a lot to think about today. Hopefully, we've inspired them to get involved, to become part of the solution.
I hope so too. The future of our democracy and honestly, the future of our planet depends on it.
On that note, I think it's time to wrap things up. Thanks for joining me for this deep dive. It's been really eye-opening.
It was my pleasure. And remember, even though the challenges are huge, our capacity for hope, for change, for working together is even bigger.